When making a list of the most evil Nazis, it's easy to come up with the names of Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, Josef Goebbels, but there are equally, if not more evil perpetrators out there who are not as widely publicized. Their names are not as well known as the leaders of the Nazi government despite their horrendous crimes. So who are they? Here is our list of the 10 most evil Nazis that you've never even heard of. See if you agree. Odilo Globocnik. Had he not been able to commit suicide just after his capture by Allied troops at the end of World War II, Odilo Globocnik, a favorite of SS chief Himmler, might have been one of the most well-known Nazis of the war. Why? Because Globocnik, a Nazi social climber whose language and greed made him unpopular even among the SS, was in overall charge of Operation Reinhardt, the first wave of killings in the 3 most notorious extermination camps before the construction of Auschwitz: Sobibor, Belzec, and Treblinka. What's more, Globocnik is one of the men who came up with the suggestion of using poison gas on masses of people rather than the mass shootings that took place in the early part of Operation Reinhardt. Philipp Bouhler. Before the rise of the infamous Martin Bormann, Bouhler was the secretary of the Reichschancellery, which meant that he was the one who controlled access to Hitler, brought Hitler news and messages, and issued the orders that Hitler wanted unwritten. Bouhler was in charge of the infamous Action T4, which was the Nazis' plan to eliminate those in Germany and without who were mentally challenged, epileptic, and those with birth defects, among others. What's more, Bouhler came up with the idea of eliminating these people rather than simply separating them from society. The method used to kill people in the Action T4 facilities was odorless carbon monoxide gas. Patients who could communicate were told they were going to take a shower and then killed. Many officers who later commanded or staffed the extermination camps got their start in Action T4, where the infamous method of killing used in the camps began. Like Globocnik, Bouhler killed himself after his capture in 1945. Aribert Heim. Heim was a doctor at the infamous Mauthausen concentration camp. Like the more well-known doctor and sadist Josef Mengele, Heim performed worthless operations with little scientific value, and no anesthetic, none. Heim injected gasoline, kerosene, phenol, and other substances directly into the heart of his victims to see how fast they died. Heim transfused mismatched blood, which killed his subjects, removed organs to see how long a person might live without them, and in at least one infamous case, dissected and slowly removed the gangrenous leg of a man while the man was fully conscious. While this was happening, Heim's team castrated the man and took out a kidney. After the man died, his skull was stripped of all flesh and sent to the notorious Ahnenerbe organization in Berlin, which studied racial differences in anatomy. Sadly, Heim escaped to Egypt after the war and escaped justice, dying in 1992. Herta Oberhauser. Oberhauser was a doctor at the Ravensbrück women's concentration camp near Berlin. She was notoriously brutal. For a Nazi camp doctor to stand out as brutal, she must have been horrible, and she was. Survivors called her a beast in human form. Oberhauser was interested in how infection was caused, spread, and killed. Her experiments included amputating healthy limbs and stopping the bleeding but leaving them otherwise untreated in the filthy camp conditions to see how long it would take for infection to set in and how long it would take to kill. Oberhauser also rubbed various substances into subjects' wounds, both amputees and not. For example, petroleum was poured into wounds and injected into the bloodstream. In addition, she rubbed ground glass, dirt, and sawdust into opened wounds, eyes, and other orifices to cause infection and kill. Unfortunately, Oberhauser's ridiculous 10-year sentence and her commutation after 5 years in prison were influenced by post-war politics, and she died peacefully in a German nursing home in 1978. Sigmund Rascher. If you've studied even a bit about the Holocaust, you've likely seen pictures of Sigmund Rascher or his victims. Rascher was the Luftwaffe doctor who conducted excruciating experiments on prisoners at the Dachau concentration camp near Munich. These were conducted at the request of Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, to study, among other things, the effects of air pressure and cold on pilots. To do this, Rascher had his team submerge men in ice-cold water until they became unconscious, warmed them up, sometimes next to naked women inmates, and did it all over again. Many died. Prisoners were also put into low-pressure chambers, an unbelievably painful experience. The Nazis took photographs of all this. Ironically, Rascher was convicted by a German court for stealing and kidnapping German-appearing children from occupied areas for his wife to call her own. As a result, he was sentenced to serve time in a concentration camp in protective custody. At the war's end, he was transferred to Dachau, where SS guards beat him to death as the war ended. Ferdinand Schörner. Schörner was an officer and had become one of Hitler's favorite field commanders by the end of the war. Schörner was the last man that Hitler promoted to Field Marshal and was the last German Field Marshal in history. By all accounts, he was an adequate general but an absolute martinet. To Schörner, rules were made to be followed, and those who did not were punished to the fullest extent of military law. Towards the end of the war, Schörner entered Hitler's good graces by being a general who would carry out his orders to the letter. This meant not retreating against all military sense. Those who did retreat and were caught were summarily shot, hundreds of them. In the war's last weeks, Schörner, who had a company of fanatical Nazis around him, both armed and SS, went berserk, ordering the immediate execution of anyone thought to be defeatist or cowardly. One example included killing 22 men for malingering, staying behind rather than fighting, but they simply had been waiting for orders. By Germany's surrender, Schörner was in command of much of Germany's remaining army and had thousands killed. Many were hung publicly, with signs around their necks that proclaimed them to be traitors to the fatherland. After the war, Schörner served 13 years in prison for war crimes. He died in 1973 in West Germany, a free but obscure man. Oskar Dirlewanger. Oskar Dirlewanger was in command of an SS brigade which consisted of men who had served or were serving time in military prisons for violent crimes, those not sanctioned by the state, such as those against fellow Germans, and disobedience. Dirlewanger recruited men at jails and concentration camps. The purpose of Dirlewanger's brigade was to carry out assignments that no one else wanted, most infamously as part of the force that put down the Second Warsaw Revolt in 1944. Dirlewanger encouraged his men to inspire terror and promised them a free hand to do whatever they wanted to do as long as they followed orders. This included mass rape and the torture of hundreds, including feeding rat poison and sexually abusing them as they died in agony. In addition, children were beaten to death in front of their parents, people were set on fire, and much more. Dirlewanger took part in these crimes, including the sexual assault of women while his men watched. Dirlewanger, called the worst of the worst by many World War II historians, died in a French prison camp, likely from injuries inflicted by guards. Hermine Braunsteiner. Hermine Braunsteiner, an SS Aufseherin, a female overseer at two notorious Nazi camps, Ravensbrück and the extermination camp of Majdanek. Behind her back, Polish inmates called her Kobila, meaning the stomping mare, because she liked to kick inmates to death with her heavy hobnailed boots. She also liked to kill inmates by beating them with a horsewhip. At Majdanek, Braunsteiner was notorious for grabbing children by the hair and throwing them on top of people already in the crowded trucks that sometimes took victims to the gas chambers. After the war, Braunsteiner served 3 years, due to a lack of witnesses. She then lived in Austria until she met an American and emigrated to the US, living in New York. In 1964, famous Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal found witnesses and tracked Braunsteiner down. After a lengthy battle, she was sent to Germany in 1973. The first Nazi war criminal deported from the US. She was given a life sentence but released in 1996 due to poor health. She died in Germany in 1999. Josef Kramer. After the war, Kramer was one of the faces of the Holocaust, but over time, his role had been forgotten by many. Kramer had been an officer at many different camps, including Auschwitz. He personally gassed 80 people at Natzweiler camp in France and had their skeletons preserved for the Ahnenerbe. Kramer was commandant of Auschwitz for a time between the two terms of the more well-known commandant Rudolf Höss, and was complicit in hundreds of thousands of deaths. At the end of the war, Kramer commanded the Bergen-Belsen camp, which, when liberated by the British, was like the scene of a horror movie. Many of the most famous films of the time depict the thousands of unburied bodies and emaciated prisoners. Kramer was hanged in December 1945. Ilse Koch. Ilse Koch was the wife of Karl Koch, commander of the Buchenwald concentration camp. Koch was reportedly a sexual sadist, deriving pleasure in the pain of others, which as the commander's wife, she also had inflicted on people. At the war's end, Koch was rumored to have had a lampshade from tattooed human skin. In the 70s, people dismissed this as too far-fetched, but since that time, it's been revealed that not only were there lampshades, but book covers as well. In 1950, she was sentenced to life in prison. She committed suicide there in 1967. And here you have our list of 10 evil Nazis you've never even heard of. We hope you enjoyed our video. Please leave a comment down below with your thoughts and don't forget to like it. Subscribe to the channel as an offering to the gods of the algorithm and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.